Hello. Well, I've been in sort of mental lockdown for the past few days because I saw the video about Daniel Shaver, and it took me a while to recover from the sight of that poor man on his hands and knees, weeping and begging for his life, and then being shot by a panicky and stupid and vicious young policeman who had been egged on to pull the trigger by a commanding officer whose profile in this whole case has been kept remarkably low, but who, in my opinion, was to blame and is guilty of murder. That's my opinion. However, it isn't an entirely unusual situation. And to prove that to you, I want to go back to 1953 in Britain. There's a famous legal case, which is called the Derek Bentley case. Derek Bentley was, I think, 20. He had a reading age of about 5. He had a traumatic childhood which involved being bombed out of his house during the Second World War, I think on 4 occasions, and he had suffered an injury which appears to have given him at least a mild form of epilepsy. He was not truly responsible for most of his actions. And he had made friends with a young man called Craig, oh crikey, what was his name? Christopher Craig. Christopher Craig was only 16 when the two of them decided to commit a crime, and they were seen at the place they were trying to rob. The police turned up. Craig had a gun. The 16-year-old had a gun, and he shot a policeman. At least that's the story. When it came to trial, Craig, being 16 and a minor, was given a prison sentence, just 10 years. Bentley, who was 20, was considered equally guilty of murder because at that time a murder during the course of a robbery involved all the participants, irregardless of who actually committed the murder, and he was hanged. The interesting thing about the Bentley trial was that the police kept on contradicting themselves, stories kept on changing. Later on, some forensic evidence, much later on, some forensic evidence came to light that it might not have been Craig's gun that shot the policeman. It might have been a police gun that did it. The police were acting very badly. One of them, the story was that Bentley had said to Craig, "Let him have it," which then was, the debate was then on, did he mean let him have the gun, let the policeman have the gun, or shoot him? And that was a very clever thing to say because the debate concentrated on the meaning of what Bentley had said rather than on whether he had actually said it. After the guilty verdict, which had an automatic death penalty attached to it, was given to Bentley, the Home Secretary would have been allowed to show clemency and to change the sentence to life imprisonment. But he didn't. This caused later on, it started the process of the death penalty being revoked in Britain. What really finished the death penalty off was another murder case involving a young woman called Ruth Ellis, who was hanged for shooting her lover. Ruth Ellis was definitely not mentally stable. She appeared to have been suffering from postpartum depression, and when her lover deserted her, she went after him and she shot him. In both cases, we have a situation where a lower class person gets hanged for shooting somebody perceived to be in some sort of higher bracket. In one case, it was a policeman, and in the other case, Ruth Ellis's lover, whose name I've forgotten right now, was definitely something of a toff. And what was going on, really, was an attempt by the establishment to re-establish authority after the end of the Second World War. After the Second World War, society was changing. First of all, the British Empire was falling apart because Britain was too poor to maintain it. And secondly, the people who came back from the war, the men, they'd seen enough to know that they didn't have to defer to the upper classes anymore. And meanwhile, the women themselves, the women who'd stayed, many of them had stayed, had worked during the war at times when they were supposed to have been just little housewives. And although some of them had gone back to being housewives, there was a feeling abroad that things shouldn't be the way they were. Everything stopped during the war, really, but then after the war ended, there was a sort of general feeling in Britain that we have to take things back to the way they were in the 30s. And they tried to do that. You can see it in the architecture. The first few years after the war, the architecture had barely changed since the 30s. People were trying to re-establish that old certainty, and they couldn't. And the establishment kept conspiring to slap certain elements in society down, and it didn't work. In the 60s, it just exploded. Now, what's happening in America seems to me to be awfully similar to that. American influence throughout the world is dropping. Yeah, I know you have this Make America Great Again, but it may yet happen. But the fact is, Make America Great Again means that you know America has dropped down some notches. Meanwhile, there are elements in society that are seething and bubbling, and the old certainties, the sort of thing you see in the Hollywood films of the 50s and 60s, they're all disappearing. And the shaver case. Here's an example of the police. They want to show that they're big, tough people who can protect America from, well, obviously they were thinking of the Nevada shooting incident, of that sort of thing. And then the courts. How the hell did the courts let that man go? It's just, as one of the attorneys, Mark Geragos, who represented the Shaver family, described the verdict as a complete travesty of justice. He said, "This criminal trial was akin to something you'd expect to read about in North Korea, not in a courtroom in the United States. It's an execution, pure and simple. The criminal justice system miserably failed Daniel and his family." It wasn't the criminal justice system. It was the entire society that's got the feeling that things are falling apart. We have to protect the police, and the police are taking advantage of that. And I think that's what's happened in the shaver thing. That's my take on it.